Welcome to the TC Dojo from Single Sourcing Solutions. The TC Dojo is a TechCom community that is driven by you. Tell us what you want to learn. You choose the topics, and we find the experts.
In the open session today, we have Bridget Brockway. Bridget worked as a technical writer for DRB Systems, an industry leader in car care solutions for nearly 15 years. She has a BA in English from Ursuline College and a Master in Fine Arts in Creative Writing, nonfiction from Ashland University. Her work has been featured on National Public Radio and in every Pigeon literary magazine. I saw this presentation when Bridget gave it at the STC Summit this last May, and I had a great time learning something new about someone I thought I knew. It was the best time I've had in a while, and I'm grateful she could be here to share it with us today. Now, Bridget says you can ask questions as we go, so be sure to type them in when you think of them so you don't forget what you wanted to ask. Bridget, it's all yours.
All right. Hello, guys. I apologize. I have just lost sound on my microphone. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, that's good. I had a headset. It sounded better. Apologies. All right. Here I go. Sharing my screen. It's coming.
There we go.
All right. And let's remember how to do a slideshow. And start. All right. Welcome to Navigating TechCom with Geoffrey Chaucer. I am Bridget Brockway. A little bit about myself. I have a bachelor's in English from Ursuline College. And a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, nonfiction, from Ashland University. Those are both small colleges in Ohio, where I live. I am currently an e-commerce copywriter. Before that, I was a freelance writer and editor. And before that, I worked for 15 years as a technical writer in the car care technology industry. So I've been doing the TechCom thing for quite a while, and I've learned some stuff. But surprisingly, I learned a lot of stuff from a dude called Geoffrey Chaucer. So most of us know Geoffrey Chaucer as the guy who wrote the Canterbury Tales, the book so filthy that high schools would still be censoring its stories 600 years later. But today we're going to talk about a very different and far less scatological work of his, which is a treatise on the Astrolabe. See, well, Chaucer is rightfully known as the father of English literature for the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer should probably also be known as the father of English technical writing, because Chaucer wrote the first substantive technical document in the English language. Now, when I learned this fact on some podcast somewhere, I obviously had to run right out and find the treatise, because who wouldn't, right? Now, being painfully familiar with Chaucer's literary work, I was expecting some impenetrable formal thing with an altogether unnecessary number of highfalutin words like "when Zafra seek with he's sweet to breathe." But instead I found a really, really good technical document, like by today's standards. So I wanted to pick it apart with you guys and look at exactly what makes the treatise remarkable and what modern day tech writers can take away from it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But first, a little bit about Chaucer himself. Geoffrey Chaucer, seen here looking like a disappointed Santa Claus, is known as the father of English literature, and for good reason. Although he's writing in the late 14th, early 15th century, in which all of England is speaking English, what we now call Middle English, most important things, and certainly most literary things, are being written in French or Latin, English being considered the vulgar tongue. And Chaucer has the guts to stand up in front of all the fancy royals and intellectuals in his circles and say, I'm just going to write in the language we all speak, if that's cool. Geoffrey Chaucer was a groundbreaking pragmatist, not two words you often see together, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But let's give a little background. Geoffrey Chaucer was born in London around 1340 into a wealthy family. Not a lot is known about his childhood, but historians have deduced from his work that he receives an extensive education, learning Latin, Italian, and French, in addition to his native English, all while managing to not succumb to the Black Death. So if you're worried that COVID-19 is going to wreck your kid's education, relax. Chaucer managed to father a whole literature while a third of Europe was dying all around him. Your kids are going to be fine. Now, when Chaucer was a young man, his father, a vintner and deputy to King Edward III's butler, secures him a position as a noblewoman's squire. And that's what begins Chaucer's career in public service. And public service is his primary occupation throughout his life. He works as a messenger and he becomes a member of the royal court. He spends many years working as a comptroller of the customs for the Port of London, and eventually served as the clerk of the king's works. Now, that's not to say that he's not also known for his writing. Around 1370, he writes the Book of the Duchess, his first major poem, to commemorate the death of Blanche of Lancaster, wife of his employer at the time, John of Gaunt. Now, the first indication we have that Chaucer is sort of a known and respected author in his time is that in 1374, the king awards Geoffrey Chaucer the promise of a gallon of wine a day for the rest of his life. And the king does so on St. George's Day, which is a day for celebrating artists and artistic endeavors. So we can deduce that this was probably a reward for his poetry. But of course, we are going to talk about his prose, his treatise. And we're going to talk about the rules that you can look at Chaucer's work and come up with some rules. Chaucer had a plan. He wrote in a language his audience understood. He knew his audience. He was clear. He was universal. He was brief. So, the treatise. Here beginneth the description of thine Astrolabe. Chaucer writes the treatise in 1391, which is fairly late in his life. He dies in 1400. According to his introduction, he intended there to be 5 sections, but we only have 2. The remaining 3 are either lost or more likely they were never written. But those 2 parts are a fantastic demonstration of our craft at its best. So in case you don't understand the Old English or the Middle English quite yet, let's talk a little bit about the Astrolabe. The Astrolabe is a complex multifunctional tool that's existed in some form since a couple of hundred years before the birth of Christ. And it's used in timekeeping, surveying, to determine the altitude of the sun and stars, and reading astrology, among a bunch of other things. It consists of a big circle with a bunch of words and numbers written on it, which Chaucer calls the moder, M-O-D-E-R, plates to be used at various latitudes that Chaucer calls retes, R-E-T-E-S, and a ruler looking bit that he calls a ruler, or calls a rule, sorry. Now, the first thing that Chaucer does that makes sense is he has a plan. And I don't think that a lot of other scholars who wrote stuff at the time did. Because if you look at some of the older texts, they're just a giant wall of words. Whereas Chaucer has part 1 of his piece is a concept doc. Now, if you've ever heard of DITA, the organization of the treatise is going to be really familiar. After an introduction that explains why Chaucer's writing the treatise and gives a concise 50-ish word description of the 5 planned sections of the treatise, part 1 is essentially what today's writers would call a concept doc. It introduces the technology and describes clearly and succinctly what a novice user needs to know to complete the steps in part 2, which is a collection of task documents. Now, Strunk and White, I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Strunk and White's The Elements of Style. It is the most important reference work, in my opinion, that any writer can have. It's a little 96-page volume. I highly recommend getting one. I think a paper copy is better because then you can put a bunch of tabs in it and mark it all up and have it next to you when you sleep. And actually, it's probably better closer to your desk, but you could have multiple copies. It's just a brilliant little instruction book on how to use the language. And one of the points in the Elements of Style, one of their elementary principles for composition is find a suitable structure and stick to it. A documentation system needs structure, order, and consistency. And it doesn't have to be DITA. My preferred structure, I like to have concept information built right into the UI in the form of tooltips. At my old company, we did some research at some point and found that if customers have a choice between opening a help topic and calling support, they're just going to call support, which costs us money, right? Even if support has already told them about the document to access it. So together with my team, we decided that we'd have tooltips explaining, like, for instance, what each column on a report meant, what all the buttons did, and so on, so that like a customer could hover over a tooltip or click on it. Sorry, I lost my place. And then if they should choose to open the help, a web help, which we created in RoboHelp, would open to a task document for that particular page or report. So you don't have to have a structure or a plan just like Chaucer had, but it's so important to have a plan and stick to it. The next piece of advice is to write in English, or at least write using a language your audience is going to understand. The treatise sort of has a beginning, or early on in the treatise, it says, this treatise is written clearly and in plain English because your Latin is not good enough, my little son. And he says that because he's actually writing the treatise to his son, little Lewis, although he later makes reference to people who readeth or heareth this. So he clearly intended for this to be for both his son and for a wider audience. Now, one of the more remarkable aspects of this manuscript is the fact that it's written in English. Chaucer was a fancy, highfalutin academic who hung out with royalty and was fluent, as we said, in Latin, French, and Italian. Now, even though, as we said, the aristocracy by that time had adopted English as a spoken language, important people didn't write important things in a language as low and vulgar as English was. The general mindset at the time was that if something was important, it should be written in an important language, Latin. But the treatise, as we said, is written to the younger of his sons, little Lewis. However, as I said, we can presume that this is meant for a wider audience. When you think about it, and it's almost as if Chaucer's making a conscious choice to democratize the ability to use the astrolabe. And isn't that what we as technical writers do, make a conscious choice to democratize the use of software. That's kind of what we're there for. He made the choice that a person could fully use to learn the tool. It used to be they could only learn to use it either by being taught or if they had access to rare texts, which they would then have to be able to understand, had to be able to wade through dense Latin in the hopes of being able to root out the information they needed. With the treatise, people could learn how to use the Astrolabe by reading a short, accessible text that, because of its length, was probably a little bit easier to get your hands on. As technical communicators, we follow in that tradition. We take impossibly complex information and make it accessible to everyone. Right now, people like us are the ones tasked with the awesome responsibility of wading through dense scientific studies to communicate to the public how to stay safe during the COVID crisis. Technical communicators are finding ways to communicate how to use remote classroom software to kids who can barely read. Tech communicators are helping locally owned restaurants stay afloat by helping them manage their online delivery services. Our ability to write in language that our audience understands is more important than ever. To that end, Chaucer knew his audience. So we know that Chaucer is writing this for his kid. And from the fact that the introduction refers to anyone who readeth or heareth the treatise, it's probably reasonable to conclude he intended for non-literate people to find the text useful as well. And that comes across in the extreme simplicity of his language. We don't even know Middle English, but we can understand this passage up on screen quite easily. Chaucer set out to write a document that anybody could understand, and he hit it out of the park. Thine Astrolabe hath a ring to putten on the thumb of thy right hand, in taking the height of things, and ta keep, for from henceforward, forthward, I will clep the height of anything that is taken by thy rule, the altitude, without mo wordus. So I think the only word we don't know is clep, which is call, or the only word we can't deduce, which is amazing. It's a different language, and yet he wrote something so simple that we can look at it and understand it. Now, there are ways to know your audience that don't involve being the father of your audience. But how do we get to know our audience? Well, if you work in an Agile office, you probably know about the concept of personas. Personas are a representation of the different groups of people who are going to use your product. An Agile team creates an imaginary person to stand in for all the members of a particular group of users. Now, I've seen a lot of different cool, creative things that have been done. I've also seen some not so great things. In my office, my previous office, I think people often sort of guessed what their audience was like rather than using research. I'm a big fan of using research, obviously. I'm not a fan for writing for made-up people. I've actually always taken a page from Chaucer's book. Once I have an idea of, what my education level of my customer is, what the age level of my customer is, I then try to transfer that to like somebody that I know. So my personas are people like my mom. She's the stand-in for my tech-curious senior citizen. My old neighbor, who we used to help with his computer troubles, is my tech-clueless senior citizen. And my husband is the tech expert who must be convinced he doesn't know something before you can teach it to him. Know thy audience. So there's a quote. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have probably have said faster horses. And that's commonly attributed to Henry Ford, but he probably didn't say it. Sorry, I lost my place again. I'm really sorry, guys. We often had a problem at my previous job when I first started, that our primary audience, which for us was the support department, would complain about the documentation, saying that they could never find anything, it was no good, the documents were too long, but then when documents were short, they were too simple. And it was really frustrating because as soon as they would tell us about a problem, we'd show them the solution and they'd be like, no, that's not the solution. Or they'd say, I can't find this document, and we'd be able to find it easily. In this particular case, we weren't getting anywhere because what support wasn't able to articulate what they wanted, and we didn't have the experience to figure it out ourselves. So in that case, I convinced my boss to let me listen in on support calls for a few days, helping the newer support staff members find the correct documents for their needs. Well, it only took a call or two for me to realize the problem. It was hard for our staff to find the documents they needed, in part because customers don't use the same vocabulary that we in-house did, and therefore that the documentation did. Customers were often loud and angry and talking a mile a minute. So the amount of mental energy the support person had to figure out or had to find the help document that they needed in the moment was really small. And when they opened the documents, they were way too long and dense. It took a lot of trial and error finding solutions to this problem, but we eventually were able to help build a system that our people believed in. There are a lot of tools for getting to know your audience, sending out surveys. That I think works less well with a larger audience, like an audience of customers, because in my experience, you get such a wide range of answers that it's hard to draw conclusions. But we had a lot of luck sending surveys to our in-house support staff and offering them prizes. We had just a incentive system at my work where you got points that you could redeem for gift cards. But we would offer them some kind of prize for filling out the survey. And of course, SurveyMonkey is a great tool for that. Microsoft Teams has a built-in tool for creating surveys if your organization uses that, as does Zoom. But surveys turned out to be really helpful for us in finding out, like, okay, we tried this. What did you think of this? We're thinking of trying that. What would you think of that? So that's know thy audience. Now let's move on to being clear. When I first picked up the treatise, I'd never seen an astrolabe, and I had no idea what one did. But with its short declarative sentences, concrete and specific descriptions, and concise, well-structured paragraphs, I had no problem at all following along. So I want to follow in detail talk in detail about some of the stuff that Chaucer did to achieve that clarity, to see if we can't do the same. William Zinsser, author of the book On Writing Well, which again is, I would say, like, I read a lot of craft books in college and grad school about the craft of writing, and William Zinsser has absolutely had the greatest effect on me, both as a technical writer and as a writer, I guess, in that he's just got an incredible gift for helping you slice to the heart of what you're trying to communicate whether what you're trying to communicate is, a short story or a technical document. Now, he says that one of the ways to be clear is using concrete nouns and strong verbs. And here you'll see where Chaucer does that. Instead of having these complicated constructions of passive voice, which were very popular at the time, he has active verbs, find and recognize and set and solve. Another way of being clear is, like Strunk and White said, don't be muddy. Muddiness is not merely a disturber of prose. It is also a destroyer of life, hope, death on the highway caused by a badly worded sign, heartbreak among lovers caused by a misplaced phrase in a well-intentioned letter, anguish of a traveler expecting to be met at a railroad station and not being met because of a slipshod telegram. Okay, we don't have to worry that much about telegrams anymore, but I have heard of cars taking serious damage because the documentation that came with a traffic gate, for instance, was unclear about exactly where the vehicle detection loop was supposed to be placed. I have heard of hours wasted on calls to a technical support department because the documentation didn't clearly support or didn't clearly describe what the numbers on a given report meant. So the customer thought that someone was stealing from them when really the report was just confusing. And the documentation about the report was just confusing. Sometimes it can feel like we're documenting into a void, unsure if anyone's even reading some of the stuff we're writing, until something goes wrong because of our mistakes. William Zinsser has stuff to say about this too. He's talks about how you can be clearer by de-jargonizing your writing. The longer you work as a technical communicator, in my experience, the harder it is to de-jargonize, because jargon starts to become your primary language. It's the language you speak in the office. It's the language you understand, and it's most convenient when you're using it with your coworkers. But customers don't speak jargon. He says, Zinsser says, we need to constantly ask, what am I trying to say? Have I said it? Is it clear to someone encountering the subject for the first time? If not, it's fuzz that has worked its way into the machinery. The clear writer is someone who is clear-headed enough to see the fuzz for what it is. And let's come back to looking at how Chaucer is clear. This is translated into modern English, but this says the back of the body of your astrolabe is divided by a line that descends from the ring to the bottom border. And we can see that line, right? This line is called the south line, or the meridional line from the ring to the hole in the center. And the rest of the line down to the border is called the north line, or else the line of midnight. So we can see very clearly what he's talking about. And he achieves that clarity by defining every component before he describes what it does and how to use it, and by giving each component its own sentence or paragraph. Strunk and White say that one way you can do this, to be clear like this, is to revise and rewrite. Read the instructions out loud and try to follow them. They say to place the really important bits at the end of the sentence when it's possible, because that's the part of the sentence that people are going to remember. And Strunk and White also remind you to use definite, concrete, and specific language. They say to put sentences in positive form. So instead of saying, these fuses don't blow very often, you would say, these fuses rarely blow. All right, next we're going to talk about being universal. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales begins, "Whan in April with his shorest suit, the draught of March hath pierced to the root, and bathed every vein in swish liquor, of which engendered is the furor," which in modern English translates to, "When April with his shower sweet, with fruit, the draught of March has pierced to the root, and bathed every vein with liquor that has the power to generate therein and sire the flower." Now, just for fun, I punched the modern English version of that text, into Japanese, and then translated the Japanese back into English, and this is what I got. When I took a shower in April, and sweet with fruits, March draught penetrated roots, and I dipped strong sake into each vein to generate and keep flowers in it. Okay, well, that's a poem, so obviously there's going to be sort of impenetrable language, and translating poetry is its whole own art. But with technical writing, it can't be an art. It's got to be real easy, right? It's a small world, and it's getting smaller every day. One day, you're almost ready to ship some self-checkout terminals to a Toronto-based grocery chain, and the next you find out, oh, they've got locations in Quebec. And now every prompt and every screen has to be available in French. Or you work for a company that traditionally only served the US market, and then someone in sales goes rogue and sells to an organization in Kuala Lumpur. So here's a passage from part 1 of the treatise. "The ringeth runneth in a matter curate, fast to the motor of thy astrolabe, so room a space that it disturbeth not the instrument after hung him his right centre." In the modern English, it's the ring goes through a kind of eyelet centered in the body of your astrolabe with enough room so the instrument always hangs straight down. Now, I plugged that sentence into Google Translate and translated into Japanese, and then translated back, right? And I got the ring passes through a kind of eyelet connected to the body of the astrolabe, and there's plenty of space so that the center of the instrument always hangs straight. Now, I don't know whether Chaucer intended for his work to be translated into other languages, whether he made his work translatable by accident or on purpose, but Chaucer is known in his time for his skill with translation, so he would be intimately familiar with the obstacles and pitfalls that can come about when translating someone else's work. Having work that's clean, simple, and ready to hand off to a translation service is one reason to care about being universal. And some ways that we can make sure that we're being universal: mind your acronym assumptions. Not everyone knows acronyms, even if you go to an English-speaking country in a different area, or a different English-speaking country, they might not know the same acronyms. One thing that's funny at our company, I would imagine that everyone knows what the term BOGO means now: buy one, get one. Our software allows our customers some systems to do a buy one, get one promotion. And when we set those promotions up, we typed BOGO on the screens. And we suddenly had this influx of customers calling to ask what the heck BOGO meant, because apparently at the time that we set it up, it was a regionalism that people all over the country didn't know. So be careful when you're assuming that people are going to know what your acronyms mean. Keep your eye out for idioms. And as a reminder, an idiom is a phrase like keep an eye out. See what I did there? is a word or a phrase that doesn't make literal sense, but that everyone who speaks a language, or most everyone who speaks a language, understands to mean something. Again, this can even be problematic when it comes to other English-speaking countries or different English-speaking countries. For instance, here in America, to table an idea is to stop talking about it. In England, to table an idea is to start talking about it. So we got to be really careful with our idioms. As Mark Twain once probably said, don't use a $5 word when a 50-cent word will do. And don't assume your similes will stand up. Simple declarative sentences structured in a straightforward manner. Subject, verb, object, whenever possible. In the words of Strunk and White, don't overwrite. Strunk and White say, rich, ornate prose is hard to digest, generally unwholesome, and sometimes nauseating. The more complex and meandering your sentences are, the harder your words are to translate, and the more likely it is that mistakes will be made. Avoid idioms, avoid acronyms. Sometimes acronyms are going to be necessary, just make sure you translate them first. If you're using the most straightforward language possible, like Chaucer did, you can be reasonably assured that any translation professionals your company might use are going to get it right. Or you might even be able to make the task simple enough that someone in-house could do it. One more thing that Chaucer did really well, he was brief. Writing improves in direct ratio to the number of things we can keep out of it that shouldn't be there. Examine every word you put on paper. You find a surprising number that don't serve any purpose. Part 2 of the treatise, the collection of task documents, contains 40 sections, each exactly as long as it needs to be. To determine the length of the day, from morning twilight to evening twilight, requires 60 words. To find the altitude of the sun, 112 words are needed. Of course, there are much longer sections for more complex operations, but each gives the impression it has been carefully trimmed to leave only the words that are absolutely needed. And that's a fundamental goal I have with every technical document I write, every document I write, I guess, to give exactly the correct answer for this information, for this audience, using the fewest words possible. How do we do that? Well, William Zinsser gives one tip, which is, I'm sorry. He says to get rid of words he calls clutter. He says fighting clutter is like fighting weeds. Clutter sneaks its way into our writing without our even noticing it. And it's quite hard to recognize it when we come to see it. For example, saying at the present time when we mean now, or it's my personal opinion instead of I think. One of the things that Chaucer, or that Zinsser points out that I could never unsee in the 20 years since I first read On Writing Well is that the word currently is almost never needed. We are currently experiencing technical difficulties. Well, obviously, you're currently experiencing the technical difficulties. If you were experiencing them last week, you wouldn't be telling them about it now. Of course, so a restaurant is currently closed. The word currently, very rarely needed. Find words, just be a detective for unnecessary words. Be brief. Zinsser also says to keep your paragraphs short. Writing, he says, is visual. It catches the eye before it has a chance to catch the brain. This is the translated version of one of the source documents that Chaucer used to write his treatise. Censor says paragraphs catch the eye before, oh, right, I already said that. In technical writing, short paragraphs or sentences or bullet points are less daunting to readers, making them likely to read and follow the directions and less likely to break something or call your company for help. For example, you got this massive wall of text compared to Chaucer's instructions. They're in these little sections. They're numbered sections so that you can find them easily. When we start to pull away some of our needless clutter and start giving information a little more room to breathe, our steps, the things that we write, become less daunting to our users. My rules for clutter-free technical writing are: never say in a sentence what you can say in a bullet point. Never say in a paragraph what you can say in a sentence. Never give in to the urge to pad a document that seems too short. Always ask yourself, is this something my audience needs to know? Strunk and White obviously have advice on how to be brief. Omit needless words. Use the active voice. Don't say, this was done to him. Say, so-and-so did this to him. Write, as we've said, with nouns and verbs. Go after those unnecessary adjectives and adverbs and get rid of them. Say it with nouns and verbs so that sentences are direct and not convoluted. And avoid the use of qualifiers like very and little. Fewer words make for clearer meaning. For example, the question as to whether becomes whether. Used for emergency purposes can just be for emergencies. Fewer words, clearer meaning. And finally, technology changes, but sending passive-aggressive notes to your coworkers never goes out of style. This is a poem that Chaucer might have written, which translates to that he might have written to his scribe. Adam, if you ever have the task of transcribing my work again, may you get a parasitic skin infection of the scalp, unless you write my words correctly. So frequently I have to correct it by rubbing and scraping the vellum, all because of your negligence and haste. So the takeaway: have a plan, write in a language your audience understands, know your audience, be clear, be universal, and be brief. And because you can't have a PowerPoint presentation without a cat picture, do you have any questions?
That was great. I've been laughing the whole time.
Now it's time to type in those questions if you haven't already. And while you do, here's a look at what's coming up. The TC Dojo Mastermind groups are monthly driven member discussion groups where attendees present their specific challenges to a group of their peers in a confidential, supportive environment. You can sign up at the TC Dojo website at mastermind.tcdojo.org. We know sometimes magic is just having the time to collaborate with someone who's been where you are.
The name of the reference, 96-page book, was that Strunk and White?
Strunk and White's The Elements of Style.
Okay. And the other one I noticed that you mentioned is William Zinzer's on Writing Well.
Correct.
I'll put all those links in the chat window for anybody who wants them, and on the event page. Here's one. Do you know how to use an Astrolabe?
I bought the Astrolabe that you saw in the pictures. And yes, I could follow the simple instructions.
Cool.
I could not use it to, tell you my horoscope, but I couldn't use anything to tell you my horoscope.
Awesome. We see very good presentation. Thanks. Great presentation, entertaining and informative.
Thank you, guys.
And we have a great one. Pushing Chaucer through Japanese to modern English was brilliant. And I agree. That was just fascinating.
Thank you.
All right. Awesome. I love Strunk and White.
Aren't they amazing?
Right? That's from Kristen.
And White is E.B. White, the guy who wrote Charlotte's Web.
I don't think I ever realized that.
Yeah. And Strunk was a professor he had who had, I think, like a pamphlet that he gave out to students. And E.B. White thought it was so brilliant that he had to turn it into a full book. Something along those lines.
That's awesome. So we have, Tim says, I've got 2 copies, one for home and one when I had an office.
Yep.
I love how you said you can have many copies, as many as you want.
Yeah, you got to have one under your pillow so you can get it through osmosis while you're sleeping.
And Kirsten says there's an illustrated version.
I did not know that.
I know, me neither. Now we're all going to have to go looking for the illustrated version, because that's great. Awesome. All right, great. Thank you so much for doing this. I laughed the entire time, even while I was learning. You are a great presenter. It's super fun.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. All right, everybody. Be sure and stay tuned. We're skipping December because it's the end of the year and we can. But we're coming back with a special dojo in January that we're going to talk about UI, UX, and TechComm in particular. Not just documenting and that experience for our customers, but us as customers of TechComm software and what we do in our everyday job. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So stay tuned, stay on the thing, and we'll see you in the new year. If you don't come to games, that is. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Bridget. That was fantastic and fun.
Thank you. It was fun for me too. Y'all
Bye,
have a good
everyone.
one. Bye.
Thanks for coming to the TC Dojo by Single Sourcing Solutions, where it's all about you. Subscribe to our mailing list at join.tcdojo.org. You'll get a link to this session, as well as announcements for future sessions, and a convenient link to the survey. Every month, we look at the survey results so we can go out and find experts willing to share their expertise. Why should we tell you what to learn? You should tell us. Vote now at survey.tcdojo.org. As always, the TC Dojo is our pleasure to host. If you need more personal help and want to speak to one of our TC Dojo Masters in Residence, just go to ask.tcdojo.org, where you can get your question answered and be on your way. Thanks again, and see you next time.